In this video, I'm going to tell you about whether you're playing with enough terrain on your table or not. A number of years ago, I did a video about terrain on your tabletop, what it's good for, why you should spend some time on, creating it, why you should go buy some if you don't feel that you can really build it yourself or whatever. Anyway, you can check it out. Pachow. But in this video, I'm not talking about the quality of the terrain. It's more of a quantity thing. To some degree, it's personal preference, admittedly. But amongst other people, it is not so much personal preference, and it's actually more of a function of the type of game itself. Let me explain. Then the amount of terrain that you have on a table, and it also depends completely on the size of the table. If you're playing with a very small table, like say Kill Team played on the normal board, which is 22 by 30, and you use 7 or 8 pieces of terrain, that's cool. If you play on a 4 by 8 humongous giant table, that may not work. But it depends upon the type of game as well. Games like big battle games, so like, let's say something like 40K, let's say something like, let's say Age of Sigmar. Those games are generally played on like a 4x4 or a 4x6, and you want to have a decent amount of terrain, but not too much. The original rules for Age of Sigmar told you to pick every 2-foot square of your board and to roll a d3 in each 2-foot square, and that was how many pieces of terrain were supposed to go in there. Now, they didn't really tell you what consisted of a piece of terrain and what was scattered terrain, things like that, and that's kind of, again, more of a personal preference thing, but it gave you a guideline, and then sometimes as you were setting it up, it was as if it was almost a little mini game. You and your opponent kind of went through, you rolled all the dice for all the different 2-foot squares, and then your opponent placed a piece, and then you placed a piece. And you could be strategic and crazy about it and all that kind of stuff. And some games tell you to set the board up in that way. It's part of the overall gamesmanship within the actual game. But there are other times when you want to set up a table to look really nice and interesting and narrative or story-driven or something like that, and sometimes it's not necessarily great for every type of game. Back when I used to play Flames of War, and I've said this before, we would spend nearly as much time setting up our little, villages that we were going to have our battles over than we would actually playing the game. That's not exactly true. If we knew the rules really well, that would have easily been true because the actual gameplay would have easily been shorter than how much time we spent. But because we always had to look up almost every rule in every phase of every turn of the game, things took a lot longer. But neither here nor there. For us, the definite real interest was having a lot of terrain because we knew that with the ranges of the weapons in the game, that's really the big deal. Having decent cover in a game that has big ranges to all the weapons is important unless you just want to basically stand out there on an empty table and see who shoots each other off first. Now, games that are predominantly hand-to-hand combat require less terrain, certainly. If you look at a game like Arena Rex, there are usually little traps and little things and stuff like that, sometimes some columns in there, but there's not nearly as much terrain in Arena Rex as there is in something like Infinity, where most of the weapons have got a huge reach of the board, and at any time you poke your head out, you can get it taken off by some sort of, hyper-futuristic bullet. So depending upon the game really helps to function how you like, or how you set up your terrain, but there's also, again, like I said, some personal preference. I generally like not only a board that is dense in terrain so that it gives me more, cover and places to sneak around, but I also like it because it looks nicer. Now, if I was playing old school Warhammer Fantasy, that would become a completely different story. Games like Kings of War, games like the new Song of Ice and Fire thing from Cool Mini or Not, games that are Rune Wars, games that are rank and flank, where you're moving rectangles or blocks of models, they need to be a lot more sparse in terrain generally because those blocks can't fit through tight spots. That you don't rearrange those blocks. That block is the block pretty much, and that's the way the game is played. So if there's too much terrain on an old school fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy board, that won't work. If there's too much on other games like anything that's rank and flank, Kings of War, if you have too much terrain, it's going to become problematic, and people aren't going to be able to make the maneuvers, the wheeling and the pivoting and all that kind of stuff that they need to be able to do in that type of game system. However, in other big army games where you're not moving the blocks in actual blocks, you're moving them more in blobs, let's say something like Warhammer 40,000, or even a game that's heading a little bit towards skirmish, maybe something like Bolt Action or Conflict 47 or things like that. In those types of games, you need to have more terrain because people like to have cover, and there's a lot of shooting in games like that. But the other thing is that you can take a blob of 15 guys, and you can do this even in a game like Age of Sigmar. I sometimes run with 20 beastmen. I know people who are running with 30 skeletons, and that's a lot. In 40K, you can run with lots and lots of orc boys. But if you have to get through kind of a narrow passage to get your unit from over here to over there, you can do it. You've got a little bit of a 300 hot gates kind of situation there, but you can kind of get them through because it's kind of an amorphous blob in that particular situation. But like I said, in Kings of War and other types of games where it's rank and flank, you don't have that ability. Now, sometimes you want that because you maybe want to be able to shoot through it, but not move through it. Totally depends on what type of scenario you're playing very frequently too. We generally, at least the people that I play with, when we sit down to make the terrain, we generally have already picked the mission. If you put the terrain down first and then figure out what the mission's going to be, very frequently you will find that the terrain does not fit the mission very well. If you're just trying to sit down and blow each other off the board, and that's not necessarily what happens at most tournaments, but at a lot of tournaments, it's less about story sometimes and a lot more about the actual game. And there's a lot more space very frequently. There's a lot more open space in games. Adepticon, Nova, LVO, the tables are all a lot alike because that makes it fair, so that you're not having one table that's really good for one kind of army and another table that's good for another type of army. And that does happen. There are certain armies that can move through cover way better than other ones can. So having tables that don't match doesn't work out. But in those situations, they've usually got a bit more space because not only is it just a little bit easier for a competitive tournament style game, but they also have, frankly, 50, 60, 100 tables that they actually have to put terrain on. So they can't make each table super crazy dense and thematic and super interesting, but you probably can at home. In skirmish games, you generally play on a smaller board, and in most skirmish games, especially if they've got a very range attack kind of thing, like your Kill Team, like your Infinity, even in games like Malifaux, you want to have more terrain because there is so much gunfire, and you want that action of being able to move from cover to cover and to make the smart moves that then allow your characters not to get shot. In the grand scheme of things, if you were in a very shooty game with no terrain, it would just be a game of dice to see who's got the best shot. Maybe some particular models have got better shooting attacks than others, and you can go through that kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is that it becomes just kind of a game of stats and dice. When you have to figure out how to get from point A to point B without leaving yourself into a line of fire too frequently, you have to make actions and movements and sometimes risks, because you have to try to run, which in a lot of games is done via dice roll as opposed to your normal movement rate. But the upside is that it kind of increases that sort of suspense and energy, because you're like, if I can just get to that spot over there, I can fire. But if I can't get over there, I'm just going to be hanging out here in the open. I'm going to get shot up, which you see in video games, you see in movies. I mean, that's the thing. Cover is important. When people are slinging lead, you want to not be standing out in the open. So knowing that really should help to sort of steer how much terrain you're going to put on the table and how close together you're going to have it, and really just, how you're going to make the whole thing look and play. There's one other kind of important thing to talk about in games that are very shooty, let's say. You have, let's say you have a lot of terrain on your board. You're playing on a 3x3 board. You're playing something like maybe, I don't know, whether it's Kill Team or whether it's, Infinity or Flying Lead from the Song of Blades and Heroes folks, or any kind of game like that that's got a lot of guns in it. The trick is that you may have a lot of terrain on the board, but if you've built it so that there are a lot of just open streets, you are building lanes that long distance shooters are being really given an advantage on. Back in, I don't play video games as much as I used to, but back in the day, there were certain maps when we were playing multiplayer games like Battlefield 1942 or the earlier, before the Source, version of Counter-Strike and things like that. Back then, there were certain maps that were known as sniper maps because there was a lot of long lanes of fire where a sniper could set up, and if you went across it, they could shoot you from really, really far away. And in games where nowadays, especially smaller and smaller skirmish games, your gun distance has not necessarily gotten a lot of shorter. On some, certainly. Shotguns can't usually shoot across the map, but a sniper rifle frequently can. So if you've set up the map that looks really cool because it looks like a city block and there's lots of streets and stuff like that, the more open space, the more trouble it is. Now, if that's what you want because you want to take that risk running across the street, that's cool. In a game like Kill Team, you can do that. In a game like Infinity, where the person can fire if they can see you, no matter where you are in your movement, they can interrupt your movement to fire at you as you come out of cover. You want to think a little bit more about how you're building your terrain. And I don't mean actually building the pieces of terrain, I mean building the setup of terrain on the table. Are there places where figures can hide so they can try to get around, and maybe it takes them longer to get from point A to point B hopefully being some sort of objective or whatever, but doing it safely might take them longer, maybe taking more risks gets it done a little bit shorter. All in all, there's nothing wrong with just grabbing a bunch of pieces of terrain, strewing them about the table, and starting to throw some dice, certainly. But I've found in the games that I remember, both kind of more visually and the story or the events that happened, it's generally the games that have more terrain. And this is because I don't play rank and flank games, where you're moving those blocks, so I don't do that kind of stuff. I like to play smaller games. Because of that, the games that had a lot more terrain and looked a lot more dense and took a lot more thought and movement, and I moved over here because I think I'm cool, but then I didn't realize that you could see me through that window, those are the ones that really stick in my mind as the fun experiences, the things that really make me enjoy tabletop wargaming. Sitting down, throwing dice, building your models, painting your models, all that stuff, that's all part of it. But think not only about constructing and making your terrain look cool, but think about how you construct the board, how you make it fit the narrative, how you make it fit the objectives, how you make it fit the story. You're going to find that you're really going to remember these games a lot more.